You need to sign over your property right now, or I'm calling the police. That's what HOA Karen Laura screamed when I returned to my inherited cabin from my grandfather. She had installed biometric locks that only opened with her fingerprint on my property. For weeks, she and the entire neighborhood treated me like I was insane for questioning her security measures. But these locks were hiding a secret that Laura never wanted anyone to discover. Comment if you've ever been threatened by an HOA Karen trying to steal your home, because the truth behind these locks will horrify you. Let me paint you a picture of how this nightmare started. There I was, driving up to my grandfather's lakefront cabin for the first time since his funeral, and honestly, I felt like I'd won the lottery. The old man had left me this gorgeous property worth probably $400,000, and I'm just an IT support guy making $45,000 a year. As I pulled into the driveway, sunlight was dancing off the lake water, and I swear I could almost hear Grandpa's voice saying, "Take care of this place, Adam." But here's where things get weird, and trust me, this is just the beginning. I hadn't even gotten my keys out of the car when this woman came marching over from the house next door. Picture the most perfectly put together HOA president you've ever seen. Blonde hair in a neat bob, crisp white polo shirt, clipboard in hand, like she was born with it. "You must be Adam Miller," she called out, with this huge smile that seemed just a little too bright. "I'm Laura White, the HOA president. I've been so worried about this property sitting empty. Now, I'm thinking this is just typical neighborhood politics, right? Wrong. Laura starts going on and on about security concerns and property management services. But here's what made my skin crawl. She kept asking these super specific questions about my work schedule, when I'd be visiting, and whether I plan to rent it out. She even wanted to know about my family situation, like whether I had siblings who might contest the inheritance. At the time, I thought she was just being thorough, but looking back, the woman was conducting an intelligence briefing. While Laura's giving me the third degree on the front porch, I noticed this elderly lady across the street watching us through her window. When Laura turned to point out some HOA regulation sign, this neighbor I later learned her name was Patricia, caught my eye, and did something that should have been my first red flag. She pointed at Laura, then slowly shook her head with a really sad expression on her face. Not like, "Oh, she's annoying," sad, but like, "You poor kid, you have no idea what you're walking into," sad. I brushed it off because Laura was being so helpful, offering to coordinate security upgrades, and even mentioning that there had been some break-ins in the area lately. "Smart locks are really the way to go these days," she said, and I nodded along like an idiot. She recommended this whole security system that would give me peace of mind when I wasn't there. Again, seemed reasonable at the time. The woman had an answer for everything, documentation for every claim, and this way of making you feel like she was doing you a huge favor. After Laura finally headed back to her house, I went inside to start going through Grandpa's things. The place was exactly like I remembered from childhood visits. Same old leather chair by the fireplace, same fishing magazines stacked on the coffee table, same smell of cedar and old books. But as I was cleaning out his desk, my hand brushed against something taped under one of the drawers. A USB drive with a note that made my blood run cold. "Adam, only open if Laura White causes trouble. Password, her maiden name, Grandpa." What the hell? How did my grandfather know Laura would cause trouble? And why did he feel the need to leave me some kind of insurance policy against the HOA president? I tried every obvious password I could think of. Laura, White, HOA, president, but nothing worked. The whole thing felt like something out of a spy movie, except this was suburban Minnesota, not Moscow. As I'm sitting there staring at this USB drive, I hear Laura outside talking on her phone. The windows were open, and her voice was carrying across the yard. I couldn't make out most of the conversation, but I definitely heard her say, "He found the USB but can't open it. Install the locks tomorrow when he's at work." My stomach dropped. Install what locks? I hadn't agreed to anything yet. But before I could process what I just heard, she hung up and waved at me through the window with that same bright smile. I packed up and headed home that evening, planning to come back the next weekend to really dig into Grandpa's belongings and figure out what the hell that USB drive was all about. I was excited about inheriting this beautiful property, but there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind that something wasn't quite right. The way Laura had been so interested in my schedule, Patricia's warning look, and now this cryptic message from my grandfather, it all felt connected somehow. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror and noticed someone standing at the cabin windows, watching me leave. The silhouette was too far away to make out clearly, but something about the way they were positioned, completely still, just watching, made my skin crawl. I told myself it was probably just a trick of the evening light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was already planning their next move before I'd even left the driveway. The next weekend couldn't come fast enough. I'd spent the entire week thinking about that USB drive and what my grandfather might have been trying to tell me. As I pulled up to the cabin again, I noticed Laura was outside watering her garden, which struck me as convenient timing. The woman had radar for my arrival, I swear. Before I could even grab my toolbox from the car, she was already walking over with that same enthusiastic smile and what looked like a tablet full of information. "Adam!" "Perfect timing," she called out, like we'd scheduled this meeting. "I've been doing some research on security options for your place, and I think I found the perfect solution." She started showing me pictures on her tablet of these sleek modern smart locks that looked like something from a tech magazine. "These are state-of-the-art biometric systems. They'll scan fingerprints, track access times, and even send alerts to your phone if anyone tries to tamper with them." Now, I'll admit, they looked impressive. Laura had clearly done her homework. She knew exactly which features would appeal to a tech guy like me. The locks could integrate with smartphone apps, create access logs, and even allow temporary codes for service workers. "The best part," she said, "is that the HOA has negotiated a group discount. We can get these installed for about half the usual price if we coordinate multiple houses at once." What really sold me was when she mentioned the insurance benefits. "Your grandfather's policy actually has a clause about security upgrades potentially reducing premiums," she explained, pulling out what looked like official paperwork. "With these locks installed, you could save hundreds of dollars a year." She had documentation for everything: HOA meeting minutes, discussing security initiatives, insurance company literature about smart home discounts, and even testimonials from other neighborhood residents. But here's where things get interesting. My cousin Mike showed up while Laura was giving me her sales pitch. Mike's always been the practical one in the family, works in construction, knows about home security, that sort of thing. I was actually relieved to see him because I figured he could give me an honest assessment of whether these locks were worth it. "Hey, cousin," he said, giving me that familiar grin. "Thought I'd come by and help you figure out what Grandpa left behind." Laura immediately started including Mike in the conversation, which seemed natural enough. "You must be family," she said warmly. "I was just explaining to Adam about our neighborhood security initiative." And Mike nodded along, asking what seemed like all the right questions about installation costs, warranty coverage, and maintenance requirements. He even took pictures of the lock specifications, saying he wanted to research the manufacturer online later. What I didn't realize at the time was how oddly specific some of Mike's questions were. He wanted to know exactly when the installation would happen, whether I'd need to be present during the process, and how the access codes would be programmed. He also asked Laura about the range of the wireless connectivity and whether the locks stored data locally or transmitted it to external servers. These weren't typical homeowner questions. They were the kind of technical details that someone planning an installation would need to know. After Laura headed back to her house, Mike and I spent some time going through more of Grandpa's belongings. I showed him the USB drive and told him about the cryptic note. Mike seemed really interested, maybe a little too interested. He suggested we try some different password combinations, focusing on family names and important dates from Grandpa's life. We tried everything we could think of: birthdays, anniversaries, even the name of Grandpa's old fishing boat, but nothing worked. "Maybe the password is something only you would know," Mike suggested. "Something about a conversation you had with him, or a shared memory." It was a good theory, and I appreciated that he was trying to help, but I was starting to feel frustrated. Why would my grandfather leave me this mystery to solve? And what did Laura White have to do with any of it? As the afternoon wore on, Mike kept taking notes about the cabin's layout, security features, and even the sightlines from neighboring properties. "Just want to make sure you're thinking about all the angles," he explained when I asked about it. "This is a valuable property, and you want to protect your investment." It all seemed reasonable, but something about his thoroughness felt off. Since when was Mike so interested in home security details? That evening, as I was getting ready to leave, Laura stopped by one more time. "I've scheduled the lock installation for this Thursday," she announced cheerfully. "The technicians will be here around 10 in the morning." You don't need to be present. I can oversee everything and make sure it's done right. She handed me what looked like an official work order with the HOA letterhead. As I got in my car to drive home, my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The line was quiet for a few seconds. Then I heard Laura's voice in the background, saying something that made my blood run cold, though I couldn't quite make out the words. The call dropped before I could say anything, leaving me sitting in my driveway wondering what the hell I'd just heard. The following weekend, I came back to the cabin with my laptop, some basic network tools, and a determination to figure out what was really going on. I'm not exactly a cybersecurity expert, but I know enough to spot when something doesn't smell right. The smart locks Laura kept pushing were already scheduled, and the boxed hardware and installer paperwork sitting on my porch were giving off serious red flags. The first thing I did was scan the wireless networks in the area to see what the locks were connecting to. Most smart locks just use your home Wi-Fi or maybe a simple Bluetooth connection, but these things have their own cellular modems built in. That's when I realized these weren't your typical consumer-grade security devices. They were professional surveillance equipment disguised as door locks. Each lock had its own SIM card and was transmitting data to servers I couldn't identify. While I was running my scans, I heard Laura on her phone again. But this time, instead of talking to some anonymous installation crew, she was having a very detailed conversation with someone named Janet Stevens about insurance documentation schedules and property assessment timelines. The way they were talking wasn't like neighbors discussing home maintenance. It was like business partners coordinating a complex operation. I decided to do some research on this Janet person, and what I found made my skin crawl. Janet Stevens was a licensed insurance adjuster who had filed claims for at least 8 different properties in our neighborhood over the past 2 years. Claims for break-ins, water damage, and other incidents that supposedly required expensive security upgrades. And every single one of those properties had received Laura's smart lock upgrades right before the incidents occurred. This wasn't some small-time HOA power trip. This was a systematic insurance fraud operation. Laura wasn't just our overly enthusiastic neighborhood president. She was running a professional scam targeting homeowners who couldn't easily fight back. The elderly, people dealing with inheritance issues, and folks who were traveling frequently for work. People like me. But here's what really got to me. Laura had spotted me examining the locks. Instead of confronting me directly, she just smiled and waved like everything was normal, while quietly setting up cameras to record my suspicious behavior. I found the first camera hidden in a fake bird feeder right at eye level with my front door. Then another one, disguised as a solar garden light with a perfect view of my driveway. This woman was building a surveillance network around my own property. When I told Mike about what I discovered, he seemed really concerned, maybe too concerned. He started asking very specific questions about my investigation methods, what evidence I'd gathered, and whether I'd contacted any authorities yet. You need to be careful about making accusations without solid proof, he warned. These people might have lawyers. He even offered to help me document everything properly, suggesting we create a detailed timeline of events and gather all the evidence in one place. Looking back, I should have realized Mike was taking way too many notes about my investigation plans. He wanted to know exactly which security flaws I'd identified, how I was planning to gather more evidence, and what my timeline was for exposing Laura's operation. At the time, I thought he was just being thorough, but really, he was conducting intelligence gathering for the other side. The scope of Laura's operation was becoming clearer every day. I started noticing her security cameras were positioned to monitor not just individual properties, but the daily routines of entire families. She knew when people left for work, when they went on vacation, and when they had visitors. She had surveillance coverage of the community pool, the walking trails, and even the mailbox areas where neighbors stopped to chat. Laura's phone conversations were getting more sophisticated too. Instead of simple coordination calls, she was using insurance terminology and legal jargon that suggested she had professional training. She talked about liability assessments, risk mitigation protocols, and documentation requirements, like someone who had been running this type of operation for years. The most disturbing discovery was how Laura positioned her equipment to look completely normal. Every camera, every monitoring device, every piece of surveillance gear was disguised as standard HOA amenities. The fake security signs that warned about neighborhood watch programs, they had hidden microphones, the decorative lighting along the walking paths, motion sensors that tracked foot traffic patterns. Even the community bulletin board had a hidden camera monitoring who was reading the notices. I tried planting a fake USB drive in an obvious location to see if Laura would take the bait, but she completely ignored it. That told me she was way more sophisticated than I'd initially thought. She wasn't falling for amateur tricks because she wasn't an amateur. This was someone with professional training in surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques. As I was investigating one of her camera installations near my neighbor's property, I watched a tiny status LED blink and then go dark. A second later, my phone saw a brief spike of encrypted traffic on a private LTE band, and the device rearmed itself. No sirens, no crowd, just a quiet system test that told me someone had eyes on that perimeter and was logging every move. The neighborhood's reaction to the first public alarm was my first real lesson in how completely outmatched I was. Laura showed up at the scene looking like the concerned neighborhood leader, clipboard in hand, ready to document everything for insurance and safety purposes. But the way she looked at me, calm, calculating, almost amused, made it clear that I'd walked right into a trap she'd been setting for weeks. "Adam, I'm so glad you're okay," she said with perfectly performed concern while neighbors gathered around us. "These motion sensors are very sensitive. We installed them after the Henderson break-in last month." She had an explanation for everything, complete with official-looking documentation and witness statements from other residents. Within minutes, she'd turned my investigation into evidence of my own suspicious behavior. The worst part was watching how easily she manipulated the crowd. "I'm really worried about Adam," she confided to Mrs. Patterson from down the street. "He's been acting quite strange since inheriting his grandfather's place, wandering around other people's properties at odd hours, asking unusual questions about our security systems. Every word was calculated to make me sound like the neighborhood weirdo instead of someone trying to expose a criminal operation." Mike showed up during all this commotion, and I was relieved to have family backup. But instead of defending me, he started asking Laura about the security protocols and whether we needed to file any reports about the incident. He wanted to know if there would be any documentation, whether insurance companies would be notified, and how this might affect property values in the neighborhood. Again, these seemed like reasonable questions at the time. What I didn't realize was that Mike was gathering intelligence about how Laura's operation worked. He was learning about her reporting procedures, her relationship with local authorities, and her methods for documenting incidents. Every question he asked gave him insight into her professional network and operational security. I thought he was looking out for my interests, but really, he was studying her methods for his own purposes. Laura used the alarm incident to expand her surveillance coverage around my property. "For everyone's safety," she explained to the gathered neighbors, "we're going to need enhanced monitoring in this area." By the end of the week, she'd installed additional cameras, motion sensors, and what she claimed were community safety devices that gave her complete coverage of my cabin and the surrounding area. The genius of her approach was how legitimate everything appeared. Every piece of equipment had official-looking labels from reputable security companies. Every installation was documented with proper HOA meeting minutes and resident approval forms. Every procedure followed what seemed like standard neighborhood safety protocols. Unless you knew what to look for, it all seemed like a slightly over-enthusiastic but well-meaning community safety initiative. But I was starting to notice patterns that didn't make sense for a simple security system. The cameras were positioned to capture not just potential intruders, but the daily routines of law-abiding residents. They monitored work schedules, social visits, delivery patterns, and even personal conversations that happened in supposedly private areas. This wasn't about preventing crime, it was about gathering intelligence for criminal purposes. Laura's phone conversations were becoming more sophisticated too. She talked about target assessment protocols, risk analysis frameworks, and operational timeline management, like someone with professional training in systematic fraud operations. When she thought no one was listening, her vocabulary shifted from friendly HOA president to cold business professional coordinating complex criminal activities. The neighborhood surveillance network was more extensive than I'd initially realized. Laura had monitoring coverage of the community pool area, the walking trails, the mailbox clusters, and even the parking areas where neighbors stopped to chat. She knew which residents traveled frequently for work, which houses had elderly occupants, and which families had teenagers who might be home alone during the day. I started testing Laura's responses by mentioning fake vacation plans and made-up work schedules to see if she was paying attention. Sure enough, within days of mentioning a fictional business trip, I'd spot her people conducting routine maintenance in areas where they could assess my property while I was supposedly away. She was using my own conversations against me to plan her operations. The most disturbing discovery was how Laura had turned routine HOA communications into intelligence-gathering operations. Every newsletter, every community meeting, every neighborhood social event was an opportunity to collect personal information about residents' schedules, financial situations, and family circumstances. She knew who was going through divorces, who had teenagers heading to college, and who might be vulnerable to insurance fraud schemes. As I was checking one of her monitoring devices near the community mailboxes, I accidentally triggered another alarm system. This time, I was ready for her response. But when the siren started blaring and neighbors began rushing outside, something in Laura's expression told me this wasn't just another test of her security system. The way she was looking at me suggested she'd been planning this exact scenario all along, and I'd just given her exactly what she needed to move to the next phase of whatever operation she was running. The emergency HOA meeting Laura called after my second security incident was like something out of a nightmare. Picture this. Me sitting in the community center facing 30 angry neighbors, all convinced I was some kind of threat to their peaceful suburban paradise. Laura had orchestrated the whole thing perfectly, presenting herself as the concerned leader, trying to protect everyone from an increasingly unstable new resident. I really hate to bring this up, Laura began with fake reluctance, but we need to discuss the safety concerns that have arisen since Adam inherited his grandfather's property. She had a PowerPoint presentation ready, complete with time-stamped photos of me acting suspiciously around various neighborhood properties. Every image was perfectly framed to make me look like a prowler instead of someone investigating surveillance equipment. The neighbors were eating it up. Mrs. Patterson nodded sympathetically as Laura described how worried she was about my erratic behavior and paranoid accusations about non-existent surveillance systems. The poor man is clearly struggling with grief, Laura explained with practiced concern. Sometimes people have difficulty processing loss, and they start seeing threats where none exist. I tried to defend myself, showing them photos of the hidden cameras and explaining about the cellular-enabled locks, but Laura had an answer for everything. Those are standard HOA security measures that were approved by majority vote last spring, she said, producing official-looking meeting minutes. Adam wasn't a resident then, so he wouldn't have been part of the approval process. Every piece of evidence I presented, she countered with legitimate-sounding explanations and proper documentation. But the moment that really destroyed me was when Mike stood up to address the meeting. I was expecting my cousin to defend me, to back up my claims about Laura's suspicious activities. Instead, he cleared his throat and said, "I'm really concerned about Adam's mental state since Grandpa died. He's been making these wild accusations about surveillance and fraud, and honestly, I think he needs professional help." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. My own family member, the person I'd trusted with all my evidence and suspicions, was throwing me under the bus in front of the entire neighborhood. Mike went on to describe how I'd been obsessing over imaginary conspiracies and harassing innocent neighbors with my paranoid theories. He made it sound like he'd been trying to help me deal with grief-induced mental health issues. What made it worse was how convincing Mike sounded. He had specific examples of conversations we'd had, but he twisted every detail to support Laura's narrative about my supposed instability. When I'd told him about finding the USB drive, he described it as evidence of my paranoid delusions about secret messages. When I'd shown him the surveillance equipment, he characterized it as my inability to distinguish between normal security measures and imaginary threats. After the meeting, I felt completely isolated. Even neighbors who had been friendly before were now looking at me with suspicion and pity. Laura had successfully turned me into the neighborhood pariah, the disturbed inheritor who couldn't handle his grandfather's death and was taking it out on innocent community members. The worst part was how reasonable it all sounded from their perspective. That evening, I was sitting in my cabin trying to process what had happened when I heard Mike on the phone outside. He was talking to someone, and his voice carried through the open windows. "Laura, he doesn't suspect anything. I'll keep feeding you his plans like we discussed." The words hit me like ice water. My own cousin, my trusted family member, had been working with Laura from the very beginning. Everything started making sense in the most horrible way possible. Mike's convenient arrival during Laura's security pitch, his detailed questions about the smart locks, his insistence on documenting my investigation methods. He suddenly became concerned about my mental health at the meeting. He hadn't been trying to help me. He'd been Laura's inside source the entire time, reporting on my activities and helping her stay one step ahead of my investigation. I sat there in the dark, listening to Mike continue his conversation with Laura, discussing my investigation timeline and my evidence collection methods, like I was some kind of target in a professional operation. They talked about my daily routines, my work schedule, and even my emotional state with the clinical detachment of people planning a business strategy. The realization that I'd been betrayed by family was almost worse than discovering Laura's fraud operation. Mike had access to everything: my theories about the surveillance equipment, my plans for exposing Laura, even personal information about my financial situation and inheritance details. I'd been feeding information directly to my enemies without realizing it. As I processed the magnitude of Mike's betrayal, I heard something that made my hands shake. Mike wasn't just talking to Laura about the weather or my investigation methods. The words I heard next would destroy everything I thought I knew about my own family and the people I trusted most in the world. The next morning brought a knock on my door that I wasn't expecting. Laura stood there with what she called an emergency security team, 3 guys in official-looking uniforms carrying professional installation equipment. "I'm sorry to do this without more notice," she said with that same false concern, "but the HOA board voted last night to implement immediate security upgrades for your property." She handed me a stack of official-looking documents with HOA letterhead, complete with meeting minutes and resident signatures. According to the paperwork, my security incidents had created liability issues for the entire community, and emergency measures were required to protect other residents. The new biometric locks would be installed immediately, and only authorized personnel would have access until I could prove I was mentally stable enough to manage the property responsibly. "This is for everyone's safety, including yours," Laura explained, as her team started removing my existing locks. "These new systems will track all access attempts and send alerts to the HOA board if there are any unauthorized entry attempts." She made it sound like they were doing me a favor, protecting me from my own supposed mental health issues while keeping the community safe from my erratic behavior. I watched in horror as they installed locks that would only open to Laura's fingerprint. My own property, my grandfather's cabin that I'd legally inherited, was being locked down by the HOA president based on a vote I'd never been properly notified about. When I tried to object, Laura pulled out more paperwork, showing that the emergency security measures had been approved by a supermajority of residents who were concerned about my recent behavior. The legal framework she'd created was absolutely brilliant in its simplicity. Every document looked official, every procedure seemed to follow proper HOA protocols, and every authorization appeared to have legitimate resident approval. Unless you understood that the entire system was designed to steal property through manufactured legal justifications, it all seemed perfectly reasonable and above board. But here's where I finally caught a break. While Laura was supervising the lock installation, I remembered Patricia Carter, the elderly neighbor who had tried to warn me about Laura during my first visit. I slipped across the street and knocked on her door, desperate for anyone who might understand what was really happening. Patricia answered with the same sad expression I'd seen that first day. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out," she said quietly, inviting me inside. "Your grandfather spent his last 2 years trying to warn people about Laura's operation. He used to sit by his radio equipment every evening, listening to conversations that proved what she was really doing." She led me to her kitchen table and spread out a collection of newspaper clippings and handwritten notes. "Your grandfather documented 3 other inherited properties that Laura targeted using the exact same methods. The Hendersons and the Rodriguez family, all elderly homeowners who died leaving valuable property to relatives who lived out of town." Patricia's files showed Laura's pattern in horrifying detail. First, she'd identify vulnerable targets, recent inheritors, elderly residents, people dealing with family crises. Then she'd manufacture security incidents to justify HOA intervention. Finally, she'd use emergency powers to take control of properties while the legal owners were fighting manufactured harassment charges or mental health evaluations. "Your grandfather tried to warn the families, but Laura's too smart," Patricia explained. "She always has documentation, witnesses, and legal justification for everything she does. By the time people realize what's happening, they're trapped in a system designed to make them look crazy or incompetent." That's when Patricia handed me the key to everything. Your grandfather left specific instructions about the USB drive. The password isn't Laura's maiden name from her marriage certificate. It's her real maiden name from before she changed her identity. Laura Rodriguez became Laura White when she moved here and started targeting inherited properties. With shaking hands, I typed Rodriguez into the USB drive, and it finally opened. What I found inside made my stomach drop. My grandfather had been conducting a comprehensive investigation into Laura's property theft operation for over 2 years. He had photos, recordings, financial records, and documented evidence proving that Laura had stolen at least 7 inherited properties using insurance fraud and manufactured HOA emergencies. The files were meticulously organized, showing how Laura would identify targets, infiltrate their lives, create legal justifications for property seizure, and then eliminate witnesses who might expose her operation. Every step was documented with timestamps, witness statements, and physical evidence that would be admissible in court. But the most chilling discovery was the timeline section. According to my grandfather's research, every single person who had tried to expose Laura's operation had died in an accident within 6 months of inheriting their property. Falls downstairs, car crashes on familiar roads, and heart attacks in people with no history of cardiac problems. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. As I scrolled through the evidence, I realized why my grandfather had hidden everything and why he'd tried to warn me. Laura wasn't just running an insurance fraud operation. She was systematically murdering people to cover her tracks. And now that I'd opened his investigation files, I understood something that made my blood freeze. According to her timeline, I was scheduled to have my own accident very soon. Have you ever discovered something about your family that completely changed how you saw them? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your story, because what I'm about to tell you next hits even closer to home. The drive held a completely different reality. My grandfather hadn't just been suspicious of Laura. He'd built a professional-level case that would have made law enforcement proud. Inside were 4 veins of proof financials, surveillance captures, victim files, and one that froze me, murder evidence. The financial records showed Laura's operation was worth millions of dollars. She wasn't just stealing individual properties. She was running a systematic enterprise that generated income from multiple sources. Insurance payouts from manufactured claims, property sales after forced transfers, identity theft using surveillance data, and even life insurance policies she'd somehow managed to take out on her elderly targets. What really blew my mind was the sophistication of her network. Laura worked with Janet Stevens, the insurance adjuster I'd researched, but she also had connections with corrupt property assessors, complicit real estate agents, and even a lawyer who specialized in emergency HOA interventions. This wasn't some amateur fraud scheme. It was organized crime disguised as suburban property management. But the most damaging evidence was the recordings. My grandfather had somehow managed to capture audio of Laura's planning sessions with Janet, where they discussed target selection, timeline management, and what they called cleanup protocols. In one particularly chilling conversation, Laura explained how they choose victims. We focus on recent inheritors who live out of state, elderly residents with limited family support, and anyone going through major life transitions like divorce or job loss. The victim documentation section was heartbreaking. My grandfather had tracked down family members of Laura's previous targets and documented their stories. The Henderson family had lost a lakefront property worth $600,000 after the elderly father died, and Laura convinced the grieving son that HOA violations required immediate property transfer. The Nakamura inheritance had been seized after Laura manufactured evidence of insurance fraud and tax evasion. Each case followed the same pattern: identify vulnerable targets, infiltrate their lives through helpful HOA services, create manufactured crises that required emergency intervention, then use legal technicalities to force property transfers while the victims were fighting harassment charges or mental health evaluations. Laura had perfected a system that made her victims look crazy while she appeared to be protecting the community. But here's what really got to me. The recording showed that Officer Morgan was providing Laura with police information about property owners, background checks, family situations, and even investigation updates. Every time someone tried to file a complaint about Laura's activities, Morgan would tip her off about the investigation and help her prepare counter-evidence that made the complainants look unreliable. Morgan wasn't just ignoring Laura's crimes. He was actively participating in them. The recording showed him providing her with confidential police information, helping her time her operations to avoid law enforcement attention, and even filing false reports that supported her manufactured harassment claims against victims who tried to fight back. Patricia joined me at the table and started filling in gaps, why she watched, how she tracked patterns, where the holes in Laura's cover really were. Her notes meshed with my grandfather's timelines like teeth in a gear. Patricia had been gathering evidence from the inside, documenting Laura's surveillance activities and recording conversations that proved the criminal intent behind her HOA activities. She'd moved here under the cover of being a retired elderly resident, but really, she was conducting an undercover investigation that complemented my grandfather's technical surveillance. Your grandfather was brilliant, Patricia told me as we reviewed the evidence together. He documented everything with the precision of a law enforcement professional: financial records, communication intercepts, surveillance photos, and even physical evidence like the specialized equipment Laura uses for her operations. The most disturbing section was labeled elimination methods. My grandfather had documented how Laura eliminated witnesses who threatened to expose her operation. The deaths looked like accidents, falls, car crashes, heart attacks, but the timing was too convenient. Every person who tried to expose Laura's property theft operation had died within 6 months of inheriting their property. The evidence showed that Laura didn't just steal properties, she murdered people to cover her tracks. The elderly residents who'd tried to warn their families about Laura's activities had suffered accidental falls. The out-of-state inheritors who'd hired lawyers to fight her property seizures had died in tragic car accidents on familiar roads. Even a local insurance investigator who'd started asking questions about the unusual claim patterns had suffered a heart attack, despite having no history of cardiac problems. Looking through my grandfather's timeline of Laura's operation, I realized why he'd hidden this evidence and why he'd tried to warn me. According to the patterns he'd documented, Laura was planning to eliminate me within the next few weeks. And that's when I heard Morgan's car pulling into my driveway. But when I looked through the window at him approaching, what I saw tucked under those legal papers made my blood freeze because it wasn't just a warrant. Morgan wasn't carrying just any warrant. He had what looked like commitment papers for a psychiatric evaluation. The same type of documentation Laura had used to neutralize other witnesses who'd gotten too close to exposing her operation. My grandfather's files had shown this exact pattern. First the harassment charges, then the mental health evaluation, and finally the convenient accident that eliminated the threat permanently. But here's what saved me. Patricia had been expecting this exact scenario. As Morgan approached my front door, she intercepted him with a story about needing police assistance with a break-in at her house. While he was distracted, she gave me a signal that sent me running to her basement, where my grandfather had stored backup copies of all his evidence in a hidden safe behind her water heater. The evidence storage system my grandfather had created was absolutely brilliant. He'd hidden cameras throughout the neighborhood, but not in obvious places where Laura might find them. Instead, he'd placed them in Patricia's house, giving him perfect sightlines to Laura's property and the community areas where she conducted her business operations. Every conversation Laura thought was private had been recorded from multiple angles. Patricia showed me recordings that would have destroyed Laura completely if they'd ever made it to court. Audio of Laura and Janet explicitly discussing my grandfather's murder. The old man was getting too close. We had to stage his fall before he could contact law enforcement. Video of them planning the timing to make it look accidental. Wait until he's alone, make sure there are no witnesses, and ensure the scene looks like a simple household accident. The most damning evidence was Laura's discussion of her systematic murder methods. She'd perfected techniques that left no forensic evidence while creating plausible accident scenarios. Elderly falls are the easiest to stage, she explained to Janet in one recording. A little oil on the stairs, maybe some medication that could cause dizziness, and the death investigation focuses on natural causes rather than foul play. My grandfather had also documented Laura's financial motive for murder. The recording showed that she collected life insurance payouts on every victim after their convenient accidents. She had somehow managed to convince elderly targets to name her as a beneficiary on insurance policies, claiming it was a community safety program that would help their families with funeral expenses. But the scope of Laura's operation was even bigger than I'd initially realized. The evidence showed she was running similar schemes in 3 different counties, always using the same methods, but never staying in one area long enough to trigger a systematic law enforcement investigation. She'd stolen over 12 properties worth more than $8 million, and that was just what my grandfather had been able to document. Mike's betrayal made complete sense now. The recording showed Laura recruiting him with a combination of threats and financial incentives. She had convinced him that I was mentally unstable and posed a danger to myself and others, then offered him $50,000 to help coordinate my intervention and eventual property transfer. The audio of Mike's recruitment was devastating to listen to. Laura had played him perfectly, starting with concern about my mental health after inheriting the property, then gradually escalating to claims that I was planning to harm family members who tried to intervene. Adam needs professional help, she'd told Mike, and if something happens to him because we didn't act, you'll never forgive yourself. What made Mike's betrayal even worse was hearing him express genuine concern for my well-being while simultaneously planning my destruction. He really believed he was helping me by cooperating with Laura's operation. She'd convinced him that my paranoid accusations about surveillance and fraud were symptoms of a grief-induced mental breakdown that required professional intervention. Patricia had been recording these conversations for months, building a comprehensive case that would have exposed Laura's entire operation. But my grandfather's death had been a devastating setback because he'd been the one with the technical expertise to analyze the surveillance equipment and coordinate with law enforcement contacts who could have acted on the evidence. Your grandfather contacted state investigators before he died, Patricia explained, as we reviewed the evidence. He knew local police were compromised, so he'd been building relationships with federal agents who specialized in organized fraud operations. But Laura found out about his law enforcement contacts and accelerated her timeline for eliminating him. The final piece of evidence that sealed my determination to expose Laura was a recording of her planning my own murder. Adam's more technically sophisticated than the other targets, she told Janet. We'll need to make his accident look more credible. Maybe a fall from the cabin roof while doing maintenance work, or a drowning incident while he's out fishing on the lake. But as I was absorbing the magnitude of the evidence my grandfather had gathered, Morgan finished his discussion with Patricia and headed back toward my cabin. Through the window, I could see him approaching with those commitment papers, and I realized I had maybe 30 seconds to decide whether to surrender and lose all the evidence forever, or run and hope Patricia's backup plan would be enough to expose Laura's operation before she could eliminate both of us. The moment I heard Morgan's footsteps on my front porch, something inside me shifted. This wasn't about property disputes or HOA politics anymore. This was about survival. The evidence was clear. Laura had murdered my grandfather, and I was next on her list. But here's the thing about family betrayal. Sometimes it cuts so deep that it actually wakes you up to reality. Mike had been feeding Laura information about my investigation for weeks, but he had also been listening to her plans for my elimination. And apparently, hearing Laura discuss staging my accident in graphic detail was finally enough to crack his conscience. While Morgan was pounding on my front door with those psychiatric commitment papers, Mike was creating a distraction that probably saved my life. "Officer Morgan," Mike called out from across the yard. "I need to report a break-in at my truck." It was a complete fabrication, but it gave me the 30 seconds I needed to slip out the back door with the most critical evidence files. Patricia had prepared an escape route that led through her backyard to a neighbor's property, where she'd hidden a car with enough fuel to get me to the state police barracks. But before I ran, I grabbed my grandfather's most devastating piece of evidence: audio recordings of Laura and Janet planning his murder in explicit detail. The conversation had been captured by equipment hidden in Patricia's basement, and the sound quality was crystal clear. "We need to stage the old man's accident while he's alone," Laura had said. "Make it look like he fell down the stairs after taking his evening medication." The recording left no doubt about what they did to my grandfather. I didn't linger. I packed the proof and moved. What really destroyed me was hearing them discuss how my grief over finding my grandfather's body would make me vulnerable to their property theft operation. "Adam will be emotionally devastated and financially overwhelmed," Laura had predicted. "Perfect target for our standard inheritance fraud protocol." They'd planned my grandfather's murder specifically to set up my own victimization. The recordings also revealed the true scope of Laura's elimination methods. She'd been murdering witnesses for over 3 years, always using methods that left no forensic evidence while creating plausible accident scenarios. "Car crashes work well for younger targets," she'd explained to Janet, "but Falls are better for elderly victims because the death investigation focuses on natural causes. As I was escaping through Patricia's escape route, I managed to intercept one more radio transmission using my grandfather's equipment. Laura was coordinating with Janet about accelerating my elimination timeline. Adam escaped with evidence, so we need to move to immediate cleanup protocol, stage his accident tonight before he can reach law enforcement. I tightened my grip on the core recordings and kept moving. The only play now was to get clean copies into the right hands before Laura could erase the trail. The backup evidence system was absolutely brilliant. Patricia had been photographing Laura's activities for months, building a visual record that complemented my grandfather's audio surveillance. She had documented the installation of surveillance equipment, the coordination meetings with corrupt officials, and even the arrival and departure times that established Laura's operational patterns. Mike finally snapped at us when he heard them spitball the roof fall cover story for me. Whatever Laura had sold him, it died right there. He created the distraction, and I got out. The family betrayal that had devastated me earlier was actually what saved my life, because Mike finally understood the magnitude of what he'd gotten involved in. Patricia's coordination with out-of-town investigators was the key to everything. She'd been building relationships with state and federal agents who specialized in organized fraud operations, preparing for the day when my grandfather's evidence would be ready for prosecution. Your grandfather knew local police were compromised, she explained as I prepared to run. So, he spent 2 years building relationships with law enforcement contacts who could act on evidence without tipping off Laura's network. As I escaped with the murder evidence, I could hear Laura's voice crackling over the radio frequency my grandfather had been monitoring. But this time, instead of planning my grandfather's death, she was coordinating my own elimination. And when I heard who else she was planning to handle tonight, I realized the nightmare was just beginning. The radio transmission I intercepted while escaping made my blood run cold. Laura wasn't just planning to eliminate me, she was targeting Patricia too. The old woman has been helping Adam gather evidence. Laura's voice crackled through my grandfather's radio equipment. We need to handle both of them tonight before they can contact state authorities. Patricia had anticipated this possibility. Her escape plan wasn't just about getting me to safety. It was about preserving the evidence that would destroy Laura's operation completely. Your grandfather spent 2 years building relationships with law enforcement contacts who could act on this evidence, she explained as we prepared to run. But we need to get the recordings to them before Laura can eliminate the witnesses. The evidence preservation system my grandfather had created was more sophisticated than anything I'd imagined. He'd been copying all surveillance recordings to a secure cloud storage system that would automatically release everything to federal investigators if both he and Patricia failed to check in for more than 48 hours. Laura's murder had triggered the first part of the protocol. Now my escape would activate the final sequence. But Laura's operation was bigger than just property theft and murder. The intercepted radio transmissions revealed she was collecting life insurance payouts on every victim after their convenient accidents. She'd somehow convinced elderly targets to name her as a beneficiary, claiming it was a community safety program that would help their families with funeral expenses and property maintenance. The financial scale was staggering. Patricia showed me documents proving Laura had collected over $2 million in insurance payouts from victims she'd murdered over the past 3 years. Combined with the property values she'd stolen through manufactured HOA interventions, her total criminal enterprise was worth more than $10 million. Mike's redemption came when he realized the full scope of what Laura was planning. He'd been monitoring her radio communications too, and hearing her discuss specific methods for staging my accident finally broke through his misguided belief that he was helping with my mental health intervention. "Adam, I'm so sorry," he said when he called Patricia's backup phone. "I had no idea she was planning to kill you." The equipment storage locations my grandfather had established were crucial for preserving evidence after his death. Besides Patricia's basement, he'd hidden recording devices in 3 other neighborhood locations, creating redundant surveillance coverage that Laura couldn't eliminate even if she discovered some of the equipment. Patricia's background as a retired police detective became clear as she coordinated our escape. She'd moved to the neighborhood specifically to help my grandfather investigate Laura's operation after her own sister had been victimized by a similar scheme in another county. "I've seen this playbook before," she explained. "Laura's methods are too sophisticated for amateur criminals. She's had professional training." The radio intercepts revealed Laura was coordinating with criminal associates across multiple counties. Her operation wasn't limited to our neighborhood. She was running similar property theft schemes wherever she could find vulnerable inheritors and complicit local officials. "We have 3 active targets in the western counties," she told Janet, "all recent inheritors with out-of-state family members." The murder insurance connection was the key to understanding Laura's financial motivation. She wasn't just stealing properties, she was systematically murdering people to collect insurance payouts while covering her tracks. Every victim had been convinced to update their insurance beneficiaries as part of what Laura claimed was a community safety initiative. My grandfather's final recordings captured Laura discussing her systematic elimination methods with clinical detachment. "Elderly falls are the most effective because death investigations focus on natural causes," she'd explained to Janet. "But we need different methods for younger targets like Adam. Roof accidents work well because they seem plausible for property maintenance activities." The timeline crisis was accelerating because Laura knew my grandfather had been preparing evidence for law enforcement. She'd discovered his surveillance equipment and realized he'd been recording her activities for months. "The old man gathered too much evidence," she'd told Janet. "We need to eliminate both him and his grandson before they can expose the operation." Patricia's coordination with state investigators was the lifeline we needed. She'd been building relationships with federal agents who specialized in organized fraud operations, preparing for the day when my grandfather's evidence would be ready for prosecution. "Your grandfather knew local police were compromised by Morgan," she explained. "So, he spent 2 years building relationships with law enforcement contacts who could act on evidence without tipping off Laura's network." As we prepared to contact state authorities, I realized Laura's operation was more sophisticated than anything I'd imagined. The radio intercepts showed she had coordination protocols, backup plans, and elimination procedures that suggested professional criminal training. But my grandfather's evidence was comprehensive enough to destroy her entire network. The final escape phase required getting to state police headquarters with evidence that would trigger immediate investigation and protective custody. But as we prepared to leave Patricia's house, the radio crackled with Laura's voice coordinating what she called code red emergency protocols, and I realized she was planning something that would eliminate not just us, but any possibility of the evidence ever reaching law enforcement. Laura's code red emergency turned out to be more sophisticated than anything I'd expected. Within hours of my escape, she'd coordinated with corrupt contacts to have me labeled as a domestic terrorist planning an attack on the neighborhood. The false flag operation was brilliant in its simplicity, turned my investigation into evidence of radicalization, making any testimony I might give look like the ravings of a dangerous extremist. The terrorist frame-up included manufactured evidence of bomb-making materials supposedly found in my grandfather's cabin, social media posts that had been faked to suggest anti-government sentiment, and witness statements from neighbors describing my increasingly erratic and threatening behavior. Laura had prepared this contingency plan months in advance, creating a complete false identity that would discredit anything I tried to tell law enforcement, but Patricia was ready for this exact scenario. As local police were setting up roadblocks to capture the dangerous terrorist, she was coordinating with state investigators who'd been monitoring Morgan's suspicious reporting patterns for months. "We've been watching Officer Morgan file false reports and suppress investigations," Agent Thompson explained when he met us at the safe house. "Your grandfather's evidence gave us the probable cause we needed to bypass local authorities completely." That's when Patricia finally revealed her true background. She wasn't just a retired police detective. She was a former federal investigator who had moved to the neighborhood specifically to help my grandfather build a case against Laura's operation. "My sister lost her inherited property to a similar scheme in another county," she explained. "When I researched the methods, I realized Laura was using the exact same playbook that we'd seen in organized crime investigations. The federal investigation had been building for over a year. Patricia's law enforcement contacts had been tracking unusual patterns in inherited property transfers, insurance claim frequencies, and suspicious death rates in communities where Laura had operated. Your grandfather contacted us after his initial research revealed the scope of Laura's operation," Agent Thompson explained. "We've been coordinating with him to gather evidence that would support federal prosecution. The smart lock analysis was the technical breakthrough we needed. Federal forensics experts used specialized bypass tools to access Laura's biometric security systems and examine their internal data storage. What they found was a comprehensive surveillance network that collected personal schedules, financial information, family data, and even intimate conversations from every monitored property. The surveillance data revealed the true scope of Laura's criminal enterprise. Her locks weren't just monitoring individual properties. They were creating comprehensive intelligence profiles on 12 different families. She knew work schedules, vacation plans, family finances, health information, and personal relationships for every household in her surveillance network. Patricia's evidence coordination with federal agents was what made the prosecution possible. She'd been wearing recording devices during her interactions with Laura, capturing conversations that proved criminal intent and premeditation. Every interaction was documented, she explained. Laura never suspected that her helpful elderly neighbor was actually building a federal case against her. The technical analysis of Laura's equipment revealed surveillance capabilities that went far beyond simple security monitoring. Her systems collected audio recordings of private conversations, GPS tracking data from residents' vehicles, and even financial information accessed through compromised home networks. This wasn't community security. It was systematic criminal intelligence gathering. Agent Thompson's investigation had been tracking Laura's operation across multiple jurisdictions. She's been running this scheme in 3 different counties, he explained, always using the same methods but never staying in one area long enough to trigger local law enforcement attention. Your grandfather's evidence was the key to connecting all the cases. The federal coordination bypassed all of Laura's local corruption networks. Morgan's involvement with Laura had been under surveillance for months, and his attempts to suppress my investigation had actually provided additional evidence of the criminal conspiracy. We've been monitoring his communications with Laura, Agent Thompson explained. Every corrupt action he took gave us more evidence for federal prosecution. Patricia's move to the neighborhood had been a carefully planned undercover operation. I sold my house and relocated here specifically to get close to Laura's operation, she revealed. Your grandfather contacted federal authorities after his initial research, and we coordinated a long-term investigation that would gather evidence while protecting him from retaliation. The surveillance network analysis revealed Laura had been monitoring not just current residents, but also tracking patterns of previous targets who died in suspicious accidents. She was collecting data on victim families to identify future targets, Agent Thompson explained. The entire operation was designed to identify, monitor, and eliminate people with valuable inherited properties. But Laura's final contingency plan was more dangerous than anything we'd anticipated. As federal agents were examining the surveillance evidence, Patricia received an emergency communication that made her face go white. "There's something else you need to know," she said with an expression I'd never seen before. And those 5 words told me that, even with federal protection, our nightmare was far from over. Have you ever had someone you trusted completely turn out to be hiding a huge secret? Let me know in the comments, because what Mrs. Carter reveals next will blow your mind. Patricia's revelation was that Laura had been planning a mass casualty event to cover her escape. The federal surveillance had intercepted communications showing Laura coordinating with criminal associates to stage a neighborhood gas explosion that would eliminate all witnesses while destroying the evidence and making her disappearance look like she died in the accident. "She's been stockpiling materials for months," Agent Thompson explained as he showed us the intercepted communications. The plan was to trigger an explosion at the community center during tonight's emergency meeting about your supposed terrorist threat. Every neighbor who might testify against her operation would be eliminated in what would look like a tragic accident. The murder evidence from my grandfather's hidden cameras was even more damning than I'd realized. Patricia had preserved video footage showing Laura and Janet explicitly planning not just my grandfather's death, but discussing their systematic murder methods with the casual efficiency of professional killers. "We have visual evidence of them planning 7 different murders over the past 3 years, Agent Thompson said. The identity theft operation was massive in scope. Analysis of Laura's surveillance data revealed she'd collected complete identity profiles on 47 different families across 3 counties. Social security numbers, bank account information, credit card details, family schedules, and even personal conversations that could be used for blackmail or further criminal targeting. Morgan's cooperation became inevitable when federal agents showed him recordings of his own conversations with Laura. Either you provide complete testimony about Laura's operation, Agent Thompson told him, or you face federal charges for conspiracy, murder, and racketeering. Faced with life in prison, Morgan agreed to detail every aspect of his involvement with Laura's criminal network. The technical evidence was overwhelming. Federal forensics analysis showed Laura's locks had transmitted over 200 gigabytes of surveillance data to offshore servers controlled by organized crime networks. The data included financial information used for identity theft, personal schedules used for planning break-ins, and family information used to target vulnerable inheritors. Janet's full cooperation was secured when agents showed her the murder evidence. "Laura never told me she was planning to kill people," Janet insisted, though the recordings prove she'd been present for planning sessions where murder methods were discussed in detail. To avoid murder conspiracy charges, she provided comprehensive documentation of the insurance fraud methods and victim targeting protocols. The neighborhood surveillance network was more extensive than anyone had realized. Laura's equipment monitored not just individual properties, but also community areas like the mailbox clusters, walking trails, and even the community pool. She had real-time intelligence on every family's daily routines, work schedules, and social activities. The evidence integration tied Laura to methods showing up in other jurisdictions. "This isn't just one neighborhood," Agent Thompson said. "We're seeing similar playbooks in multiple cases. Your grandfather's files give us leads to compare across states." Laura's financial assets were frozen as federal agents traced the money trail from her criminal operation. Over $8 million in stolen properties, insurance payouts, and identity theft proceeds were recovered and prepared for return to victim families. "Every dollar Laura stole will be returned to the families she victimized," Agent Thompson promised. The community vindication was almost overwhelming. Neighbors who'd been convinced I was mentally unstable started approaching federal agents to report suspicious activities they'd noticed but hadn't understood. "Laura always seemed to know too much about everyone's personal business," one neighbor admitted. "But we thought she was just being helpful." The systematic surveillance had violated every family's privacy in ways they were only beginning to understand. Laura's equipment had recorded private conversations between spouses, monitored teenagers' activities, and even collected audio from bedroom areas where families thought they had complete privacy. Agent Thompson's investigation revealed Laura's operation had been responsible for at least 12 suspicious deaths across 3 counties. "Every person who tried to expose her operation or resist her property theft schemes died in convenient accidents," he explained. "Your grandfather's evidence finally gave us the pattern recognition we needed to prove systematic murder." The criminal network's collapse was swift once federal agents had the evidence. Laura's associates abandoned the operation as soon as they realized federal authorities were involved. "Professional criminals avoid federal attention," Agent Thompson explained. "Once they knew we were investigating, they cut all ties with Laura to protect themselves." But even with overwhelming evidence and federal protection, Laura had one final card to play. As agents were coordinating the arrests of her remaining associates, she activated what she called her patriotic defense protocols, claiming that she and all her activities had been legitimate national security operations designed to protect American communities from foreign infiltration. The federal agents who arrived to arrest Laura seemed to take her claims seriously enough to examine them, and something in their faces told me that her final manipulation attempt might actually work. After everything we'd been through, everything we'd discovered, Laura's last gambit could still destroy us all. Laura's patriotic defense was absolutely masterful in its audacity. She presented federal agents with fabricated documents claiming that she and I were both foreign operatives, me working for hostile governments to steal American property, and her working for domestic intelligence agencies to stop the infiltration. According to her story, everything she'd done was part of a classified national security operation designed to protect American communities from foreign property acquisition. The fake documentation she produced was incredibly sophisticated. Official-looking intelligence briefings that described a systematic foreign operation targeting inherited American properties, complete with organizational charts showing how overseas criminal networks were using local operatives to acquire strategic real estate. My grandfather's investigation was reframed as evidence that he'd been recruited by foreign intelligence services to document American security measures. Laura's manipulation exploited post-9/11 fears about domestic terrorism and foreign infiltration. She claimed her surveillance network had been defensive intelligence gathering, designed to identify and neutralize foreign operatives who were using property inheritance schemes to establish operational bases in American communities. "Everything I did was to protect this neighborhood from foreign subversion," she told the federal agents with practiced sincerity. The genius of her approach was how it recontextualized all the evidence against her. The surveillance equipment became defensive counterintelligence tools. The insurance fraud became operational funding for legitimate security activities. Even the murders were reframed as the necessary elimination of foreign agents who posed threats to national security. But here's where Laura made her fatal mistake. She underestimated the federal agent's ability to verify intelligence claims. Agent Thompson had immediate access to classified databases that could confirm or debunk any legitimate national security operation. "There's no record of any authorized intelligence activity in this area," he told her flatly, "and no foreign infiltration operation matching your description." Instead of debating her claims, agents published the findings to the neighborhood plain language, plain facts. The room turned cold. People didn't need a demo, they needed the truth in writing. "These devices were collecting your personal financial information," Agent Thompson announced as technicians extracted data storage modules. Bank account numbers, credit card details, social security numbers, and even recordings of private conversations between family members. The crowd's reaction shifted from curiosity to horror as they realized the scope of Laura's surveillance violation. The data extraction process revealed surveillance capabilities that went far beyond anything the neighbors had imagined. Laura's locks had been recording intimate family conversations, monitoring teenage activities, tracking work schedules, and even collecting audio from bedroom areas where families thought they had complete privacy. Laura's psychological breakdown began when she realized her patriotic defense wasn't working. Federal agents weren't impressed by her fabricated intelligence documents, and the neighborhood residents were turning against her as they learned about the surveillance violations. "You don't understand," she kept insisting. "I was protecting all of you from foreign infiltration." The community testimony was devastating for Laura's credibility. Neighbor after neighbor came forward to describe unauthorized insurance claims, unexplained property incidents, and surveillance violations they'd experienced under Laura's supposed security program. "She filed insurance claims on my property without my knowledge," one resident testified. "When I questioned her about it, she said it was part of a community safety initiative." The technical evidence completely contradicted Laura's national security claims. Federal analysis showed her surveillance equipment had been transmitting data to offshore criminal networks, not domestic intelligence agencies. "These systems were designed for criminal intelligence gathering," Agent Thompson explained. "There's no legitimate security purpose for collecting this type of personal data." Laura's desperation became obvious as she started making increasingly wild claims about foreign infiltration and national security threats. "Check the basement contracts," she screamed as federal agents prepared to arrest her. "Adam's grandfather was working with foreign agents. There's evidence hidden in the foundation." She was throwing out anything that might cast doubt on the investigation. The forensic examination of Laura's equipment revealed systematic criminal activity that had nothing to do with national security. Her systems had been used to coordinate neighborhood crime schedules, plan break-ins during family vacations, and even blackmail residents using compromised personal information. Agent Thompson's patience finally ran out when Laura started claiming that federal agents themselves were part of the foreign infiltration operation. "You're all compromised," she accused. "This entire investigation is designed to protect foreign operatives from legitimate American security measures." Her paranoid accusations only reinforced the evidence of her mental instability and criminal desperation. The final nail in Laura's coffin was when federal technicians found evidence of her coordination with organized crime networks. "These communication logs show contact with known criminal organizations," Agent Thompson announced. "There's nothing patriotic about identity theft, insurance fraud, and systematic murder." But as federal agents moved to arrest Laura, one of them turned to me with a look of complete shock and said, "You need to see this right now." Whatever they had found in Laura's surveillance data was significant enough to stop the arrest procedure and gather all the federal agents for an emergency consultation. What the federal agents had discovered was Laura's complete victim database. Not just the 7 murders my grandfather had documented, but evidence of 23 suspicious deaths across 5 different states. Laura's operation was part of a nationwide criminal network that had been systematically targeting inherited properties and eliminating witnesses for over 8 years. "This isn't just insurance fraud," Agent Thompson explained as he showed me the database. "Laura's methods are being used by organized crime networks across the entire country. Your grandfather's investigation helped us identify a pattern that we'd been missing because the crimes were spread across so many different jurisdictions." Laura's psychology finally cracked completely when she realized the scope of the evidence against her. Her carefully constructed persona as a helpful HOA president dissolved into the reality of a professional killer who'd been operating with criminal precision for nearly a decade. "You don't understand what you've done," she ranted at the federal agents. "These people were all foreign operatives threatening American security." The community testimony was emotionally devastating, as neighbors realized how completely Laura had violated their privacy and manipulated their trust. Mrs. Patterson broke down crying as she learned that Laura had been recording private conversations with her terminally ill husband. "She knew about his cancer diagnosis before I told anyone," she sobbed. She used his medical information to plan insurance fraud. The technical evidence chain was absolutely comprehensive. Federal forensics experts demonstrated how Laura's surveillance network had collected over 500 gigabytes of personal data from neighborhood families, transmitted it to criminal networks for identity theft purposes, and used it to coordinate systematic property crimes during family vacations and work travel. Janet's complete testimony revealed the operational details of Laura's murder methods. "She had protocols for everything," Janet admitted under federal questioning. "Specific techniques for staging accidents, timing methods to avoid forensic detection, and even backup plans if the initial murder attempts failed." The insurance investigation revealed Laura's operation had defrauded multiple companies out of over $4 million in false claims. Every break-in and property damage incident had been staged using surveillance data to ensure families were away from home during the manufactured crimes. Morgan's full cooperation provided the missing pieces about Laura's corruption network. She had contacts in law enforcement, insurance companies, and even local government offices, he testified. Every official who might investigate her activities was either corrupted with bribes or eliminated through blackmail and threats. Laura's final breakdown was complete when federal agents presented her with evidence of her coordination with organized crime networks. The surveillance data showed communications with criminal organizations that specialized in inheritance fraud, identity theft, and witness elimination. "These aren't national security operations," Agent Thompson told her. "These are organized crime activities." The murder conspiracy evidence was overwhelming. Federal agents had audio recordings of Laura planning systematic elimination of witnesses, video evidence of her coordinating murder methods with criminal associates, and financial records showing payments received for successful cleanup operations that eliminated threats to the criminal network. Laura's last desperate attempt to maintain her patriotic cover story fell apart when federal agents presented her with communications showing her coordination with foreign criminal networks. "You were working with the exact type of foreign criminals you claim to be fighting," Agent Thompson pointed out. "Your entire operation was designed to steal American property for overseas criminal organizations." The physical evidence from Laura's surveillance equipment included blackmail material she'd collected on neighborhood families, financial information used for identity theft, and even personal photographs that had been stolen from monitored homes. "She had compromising information on every family in the neighborhood," Agent Thompson explained. "This was systematic criminal intelligence gathering. My grandfather's evidence had been the key to exposing a nationwide criminal network that specialized in targeting inherited properties. Your grandfather's investigation helped us connect cases across multiple states," Agent Thompson told me. "Without his documentation, we might never have identified the pattern." The perfect justice moment came when federal agents arrested Laura using evidence from her own surveillance equipment. The sophisticated locks she'd used to monitor and control the neighborhood became the primary evidence that proved her systematic criminal activity and ensured her conviction on federal charges. Laura's sophisticated criminal operation was destroyed by my grandfather's patient documentation and one old man's radio equipment. The high-tech surveillance network she'd spent years building became the evidence that sent her to federal prison for organized crime, murder conspiracy, and systematic fraud. But as Laura was being led away in handcuffs, she turned back to me with a smile that suggested this wasn't really over. And then my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number that made me realize we'd only exposed one part of a much larger criminal organization. The real game was just beginning, and Laura's arrest might have made me a target for criminal networks I didn't even know existed. You know what's funny about surviving something like this? It's not the dramatic courtroom scenes or the newspaper headlines that stick with you. It's the quiet moments when you realize how close you came to losing everything. Sitting in that federal courthouse, watching Laura Rodriguez get sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for racketeering, murder conspiracy, and organized fraud, I kept thinking about my grandfather's patience and wisdom. The judge's words during sentencing really captured the scope of what Laura had done. You systematically targeted vulnerable families during their most difficult moments, exploiting grief and confusion to steal their inheritances and, in some cases, their lives. This court finds your actions represent organized crime of the most predatory nature. Laura showed no emotion as the gavel came down, but I saw her scan the courtroom one last time with those calculating eyes. The financial recovery was more than I'd ever expected. Between restitution payments and property damages, I received $430,000 as money that represented not just my grandfather's stolen property, but compensation for the trauma and systematic violation Laura's operation had inflicted on our entire community. It felt surreal having that kind of financial security, knowing it came from surviving something that had destroyed so many other families. Mike's apology was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had. I genuinely thought I was helping you deal with grief-induced paranoia, he explained, tears in his eyes. Laura showed me documentation that made it look like you were having a breakdown, and I believed her completely. The family betrayal had cut deep, but understanding how sophisticated Laura's manipulation had been made forgiveness possible, if not easy. The community healing process was something beautiful to witness. Neighbors who had been convinced I was mentally unstable started approaching me with their own stories of things that hadn't seemed right about Laura's operation. She always knew too much about our personal business, one neighbor admitted, but we thought she was just being helpful. Suddenly, everyone had examples of surveillance violations they'd normalized because Laura had made them seem like community safety measures. Morgan losing his job and facing federal charges for corruption felt like justice. But it also highlighted how vulnerable our community had been to systematic criminal infiltration. When local law enforcement is compromised, Agent Thompson explained, entire communities become targets for organized crime operations. The realization that our suburban paradise had been systematically exploited was sobering for everyone. The neighborhood transformation was remarkable. We established a real community watch program, not the fake surveillance network Laura had created, but actual neighbors looking out for each other with transparency and accountability. Patricia Carter became our unofficial security consultant, teaching us how to recognize legitimate versus predatory security measures. Patricia and I developed a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared survival. Your grandfather would be proud, she told me, as we worked together to help other inheritance fraud victims. He always believed that community connections were stronger than any surveillance technology. She taught me about recognizing fraud schemes, understanding criminal psychology, and building networks that actually protect people instead of exploiting them. The simple truth that emerged from this whole nightmare was that my grandfather had been right about everything. Technology can be used to help or harm people, but it's human connections and community vigilance that provide real security. Laura's sophisticated surveillance network had been defeated by an elderly man with a radio and neighbors who cared enough to pay attention to what was really happening. The career change felt natural. Using the settlement money to train as a victim advocate gave my life more meaning than IT support ever had. Working with families who'd survived inheritance fraud, identity theft, and property scams felt like honoring my grandfather's memory while helping people rebuild their lives after systematic victimization. Janet Stevens received 3 years probation in exchange for her cooperation with federal investigators. Her testimony had been crucial for understanding the operational details of Laura's network, but hearing her describe the insurance fraud coordination with such clinical detachment was disturbing. We process these cases like any other business transactions, she'd testified. Laura made it seem routine and legitimate. The real victory wasn't the money or the prison sentences. It was learning that heroism doesn't require being the smartest person in the room. My grandfather had defeated a sophisticated criminal operation using patience, community connections, and the determination to keep fighting when everyone thought he was wrong. He'd taught me that sometimes the old ways really do work better than the new ones. The technology lesson was profound. I kept one of Laura's dismantled smart locks as a reminder that surveillance tools should serve people, not control them. Every time I looked at those sophisticated components, I remembered how close I'd come to losing everything because I'd trusted technology over human intuition and community relationships. My grandfather's legacy lived on through the neighborhood watch program we established using his community-based approach. Instead of hidden cameras and secret monitoring, we built a network based on open communication, mutual support, and transparent security measures. Neighbors actually knew each other's names now, checked on elderly residents, and shared information about legitimate safety concerns. The ripple effects extended far beyond our neighborhood. Federal investigators used my grandfather's evidence to identify and prosecute similar operations in 7 other states. Your grandfather's documentation methods are being taught to law enforcement agencies nationwide, Agent Thompson told me. His investigation techniques helped us understand how organized crime networks exploit suburban communities. But the most important lesson was about trust and family. Mike and I rebuilt our relationship slowly, based on understanding how sophisticated manipulation can destroy even close family bonds. Laura convinced me I was protecting you, he'd said. She showed me exactly what I needed to see to believe you were in danger. Forgiveness came when I realized that family loyalty can be weaponized by people who understand human psychology. 6 months later, I was sitting on my grandfather's porch, my porch now, watching the sunrise over the lake and thinking about how much had changed. The cabin felt peaceful in a way it never had when Laura was running her surveillance operation. No hidden cameras watching my every move. No biometric locks controlling my access to my own property. Just the simple security of knowing my neighbors actually cared about each other's well-being. Patricia had become like family to me. Every morning, we'd have coffee together, and she'd share stories about my grandfather's investigation methods and his determination to protect people from predators like Laura. He used to say that criminals rely on people being too polite to question authority, she'd tell me. Your grandfather wasn't polite when it came to protecting his community. The friendship we'd built was based on mutual respect and shared survival, but also on a common mission to help other people recognize and resist systematic fraud operations. Patricia taught me how to spot the early warning signs of inheritance scams, property theft schemes, and identity fraud operations that target vulnerable families during difficult transitions. My new career as a victim advocate felt like the work I was meant to be doing. Instead of troubleshooting computer problems, I was helping families rebuild their lives after being systematically victimized by organized crime networks. The settlement money had given me the financial freedom to pursue meaningful work instead of just paying bills. The cases I worked on were heartbreakingly similar to what Laura had done to our neighborhood. Elderly residents are being manipulated into signing over property rights, recent inheritors are being targeted by fake HOA officials, and families dealing with grief are being exploited by people who understand their vulnerabilities. But now, I knew how to help them fight back. Janet's cooperation with federal investigators had led to the prosecution of Laura's criminal network across multiple states. Your case broke open investigations we'd been working on for years, Agent Thompson told me during one of our follow-up meetings. Laura's methods were being used by organized crime operations, targeting inherited properties nationwide. The neighborhood healing continued to evolve in positive ways. We'd established regular community meetings where people could share concerns, discuss safety issues, and coordinate genuine mutual support. The difference between Laura's fake community involvement and real neighborhood cooperation was like night and day. Mike and I had rebuilt our relationship, but it was different now, stronger in some ways because we'd both learned how easily family bonds can be manipulated by people who understand human psychology. I thought I was protecting you, he'd said during one of our conversations. Laura convinced me that questioning her methods meant abandoning family responsibility. The real victory was the community network we'd built, using my grandfather's approach to neighborhood security. Instead of hidden surveillance and secret monitoring, we created a system based on open communication, mutual support, and transparent safety measures. People actually knew their neighbors now, checked on elderly residents regularly, and shared information about legitimate safety concerns. Laura's 12-year federal sentence felt appropriate, but I knew the criminal networks she'd been part of were still operating in other communities. The message from that unknown number after her arrest had been a reminder that exposing one operation doesn't eliminate the entire system. Your grandfather's investigation was just the beginning, Patricia had warned me. These networks adapt and relocate when they're exposed. On the desk sits a small brass plate from my grandfather's radio rig. When the room is quiet, I can still hear the soft hiss of the band he used to ride proof that patience and clear signals beat noise every time. My grandfather's radio equipment had become a symbol of how simple tools used with wisdom and patience can defeat sophisticated criminal operations. Laura's high-tech surveillance network had been exposed by an elderly man who understood that human connections and community vigilance provide better security than any surveillance system. The final reflection that stuck with me was about the nature of heroism and justice. I wasn't the smartest person in the room, the most technically sophisticated investigator, or the most qualified person to expose organized crime, but I'd had the advantage of a grandfather who'd prepared for this fight, a community ally who'd supported the investigation, and the determination to keep going when everyone thought I was wrong. Laura had used cutting-edge surveillance technology to control everyone around her, but she'd been defeated by a ham radio, some hidden cameras, and neighbors who cared enough to pay attention to what was really happening. Sometimes the old ways really do work better than the new ones. The message I want to leave you with is this: trust your instincts when something doesn't feel right, even if everyone else thinks you're being paranoid. Build real relationships with the people around you, because community connections provide better security than any surveillance system. And remember that heroism isn't about being the smartest or strongest person. It's about caring enough to keep fighting for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible.